Okay, I'm here to do another episode of Thorin's Theories, and you've seen the other teams we've done. This time it's another NA team, and it's actually probably the most successful NA team of all time at this point. It's Cloud9. A little bit of background on Cloud9. We all remember the way they first came into the league was actually with hype before they'd even played an LCS match. They tore through the amateur scene with the lineup that they'd formed, the one that you see now. But what really made them kind of a tease to come into LCS was this storyline that we heard, that they had this 90% win rate over teams like TSM, who just won the spring split, over CLG. They were apparently beating all these teams, Dignitas. They were just crushing these teams in scrims. Now people thought, well, will that rate, is that just scrims? Is that just teams haven't figured them out yet or what? And so they came in the summer split, and they had an unreal split. They only lost 3 games in the regular part of the split, and then in the playoffs they just went undefeated, 5-0, and they won the whole playoffs. So okay, went into Worlds. International competition wasn't quite as good. They were decent, but they were losing to Fnatic, lost to Gambit, come back again in the spring split. Everyone said, okay, right, last split they dominated, but that won't happen again. Okay, it'll be a lot closer this time. Looked like it was right initially, because even though it wasn't close between Cloud9 and the other teams in the league, TSM now was at Cloud9's level. In fact, TSM, by winning an early game on them, stayed like a win ahead of them throughout the whole season. So even though Cloud9 was actually winning at a really nice clip, it looked like, okay, because TSM's ahead of them and holding the first spot, it looked like, okay, now actually maybe Cloud9 isn't going to win. But at the end of the season, TSM took a dip, Cloud9 went up again. They managed to finish the end of the split, believe it or not, only losing 1 extra game than their record-breaking one before. This time they went 22 to, well, that can't be right. It must be 24 to 4. Compared to the 25-3 of the summer split. So they won another split, and they go into the playoffs again, 5-0, undefeated in the playoffs. They win a second straight split. So now we get to this season. Now this season, you saw the level of the teams, the rosters made it like, okay, maybe CLG is going to be even better with Seraph. That's what people hope for, a strong top laner. Dignitas surely on paper looked like they were going to be stronger. They got Shifter, they got Zion Spartan. Curse gets X Special from TSM. Okay, TSM loses X Special, but they get Amazing to upgrade from the odd one. You're thinking to yourself, look at all these teams. LMQ comes in who have their own hype built from the amateur scene. In theory, this time, people are saying that there's no way this time Cloud9 is going to win. It could be any of these other teams. It's going to be so close the whole way. It was very close the whole season through. In fact, what's interesting is, here's another split where Cloud9 was never in first place for all these weeks. This time, even worse, they'd be down in 3rd, they'd be down in 4th. Eventually, at the end of the split, same story as always, they picked it up, they got strong, and they managed to finish 1st overall at the end of the split. Now, they won 18 games and lost 10. Okay, twice, let me think, there's 3 or just over 2 points something over the past season, so they lost a lot more games, and they didn't finish first clear cut. This time they were actually tied with LMQ, but they had the tiebreaker on head-to-head there. But they managed to win another regular split. They won the past playoffs, so now people are wondering, are they going to win this playoff? With the way the seeding went, they were on the side of the bracket that had CLG and it had Curse. And they're going to play against Curse in the semi-finals now. They managed to get a position where, despite not being first all that time, there was a reason to say that they were strong. I made a piece about this actually, where if you looked at their performance against other top teams in the top 4 or 5, they always had the best record. They were winning like 70-80% of the games against the other top teams. It was actually games against teams like Cole that was letting them down. Games against Curse, before Curse was in the top 5, that was letting them down. That was what was bringing their record down and putting them down with other people. Well, coming to the playoffs, they've still got a great performance overall, because when the playoffs began, they had a 3-1 record, 75% win rate from the regular split over every playoff team except TSM. TSM, they were, and even then they were 2-2. They were 50% there. So what a great record. It's putting them in position, not only just because they're first in the split, because of their actual performance, the way they match up against the other teams, that you have to put them as the favourite again. The 3 teams they lost to the most in the regular part of the split was Evil Geniuses, Complexity, and then TSM. And all these teams, they just went 2-2 with. So again, 50% win rate against all these teams. They're not getting dominated by anyone, despite the fact that they might have looked like they had an up and down season. The end of the split was very strong as well. They won 7 of their last 8. And so when you come into the playoffs, okay, they have lost a lot more games in the regular split. Now you have to ask, will it be also a little bit different in the playoffs? Because remember, the key thing was, in the past, they've never lost a playoff game. They're actually 10-0 in the past 2 seasons of playoffs. So if they were to lose even 1 game, that would actually be historic in its own way, even though it's normal that a team can lose a game in a best of 5, best of 3, Of all the teams in the second half of the split, they were the ones with the most wins. They had 10 wins over the second half of the split. Whereas, for example, think of a team like Dignitas, who'd led the league for so long and been right near the top. They had only 4. TSM, Curse, 8. LMQ, admittedly 9, that's pretty strong as well. CLG, only 4, down with Dig. So we saw a real shifting of that tight pack that had been almost impossible to separate, it seemed, for the middle part of the split. In terms of their overall team stats, these really tell the story of the classic strength of Cloud9. They have the highest amount of towers per minute. They have the best dragons. They're number 1 in dragons. But interestingly, they're only 5th in barons. And actually for teams that win a lot of games, that's quite low. So let's think about that for a second. Highest in towers per minute. Now that actually, I would have guessed that before I'd seen this here. Because if I think of the classic Cloud9 of the spring split here and the summer split before, they always know when to trade an object, when to give up the dragon so they can take this tower over here. If someone's taking a tower here, will we get there in time? No, right, go and take a different tower here and put pressure on over there. When you get kills, turn the kills into, if you get the 2 kills, if you get the 3 kills, turn that into a tower. If you kill the specific right person that had the wave clear, turn that into a tower. It's like Cloud9 are always thinking of map pressure and objective control. That's like their way they're going to win the game. Admittedly, in the spring split and in the especially in the summer split, the one they dominated last year, yeah, they had incredible team fighting, and METEOS was is most fed, the most farmed up. He was like impossible to kill. In that world, they could have all the objective control, but they could also take a lot of fights and win them. In this world, where I talked before, some of the rosters that have upgraded, you can't necessarily just fight all the time, especially with teams like LMQ in the league. You don't necessarily want to fight against Dig and LMQ in big team fights. So if you can win by getting the objectives, getting towers, actually making better decision making on what to do once the flow chart, that's what I've always felt must be very solid in Cloud9's mind. They understand when X happens, then do we do Y, Z, or do we do A? Some other teams, they seem a bit lost, or they always do one sort of thing and that works. Sometimes it doesn't because it makes it more predictable. Cloud9 always somehow figure it out in the moment. The Barons one is interesting though, because I wonder how much of that is, for example, METEOS' impact has been a bit less split, so you haven't got the dominant jungler in the same sense. Team fighting, again, it isn't as effective as it was in a world where some of the teams themselves were a bit weaker at team fighting, whereas that's one of the areas where I think a lot of the teams have gotten a lot better. Even when Cloud9 lose, this is another factor that's always been there for Cloud9. They're one of the toughest to actually take out of a game when they're behind. They have the highest average towers per loss. Now, this is the same philosophy they've got. When they're ahead, they turn it into towers, they turn it into objectives, they get themselves more ahead, but without risking dying and taking on a fight with someone who actually might be able to outskill you still. When they're losing, that's how they're getting back into games. They're behind a bit, they take some towers, they figure out how to get a tower here and hold a tower up here, they've got them ahead in that way. They don't have to fight to get back into games necessarily. They have the highest gold per minute in losses. I mean, I saw a stat a while back that said that they often would actually farm up when they started to lose, so that kind of makes sense. But interestingly, they have the second most comeback wins at 20 minutes. They managed 6 times this season. Now, if you think of the old Cloud9, here's something people don't realise. When Cloud9 dominated in those 2 splits, so they only lost 7 regular season games over the summer split of last year and the spring split of this year. Only 7 games. Okay, the games they lost, yeah, there was a couple where they got outplayed. Most of them were close games, but here's what's interesting. Of all the games they won, there would actually be a decent amount. Off the top of my head, I'd say maybe a third of the games they won, they were in situations where people had them behind early, or halfway through the game they had a decent deficit. Occasionally they'd have a big deficit, but they were so good at getting back into these games. They just understood how to take advantage of small mistakes that the enemy would make. And since the enemy couldn't cleanly close them out, because a lot of the teams in NA were quite bad at closing out games then, Cloud9 would just work their way back into games. And it's like they had the mentality that as long as we're not completely blown out, whole items behind, etc., we can still do this. We can still find the fights. We can still get those free uncontested dragons. We can still know when to take the right Baron fight. We can grind them out by taking towers and getting that lead back. Cloud9 were always a team who knew how to win from almost any situation, from behind, from ahead, from a tied game, situations where one player's going off. Somehow they could always get themselves, not necessarily to the perfect decision, but to one that that they could get something from that actually made sense in some way. If we talk now about some of the players in Cloud9, let's just start at the top of the map and work our way down. Balls, you probably could have made a solid case in the past splits that he was the carry player of their team. Now, in a sense, obviously METEOS is the carry jungler, but of the traditional laners, we usually expect the carry in the modern day to usually be the mid or the AD carry. But okay, top, historically in the past, that used to be a real carry position as well. Balls used to be the one out of the top, the mid and the AD carry, who you expected each game to be like the stronger one actually of them, and to synergize with METEOS. This split, okay, we've seen, it just feels like he's dropped off. You look at some of the games, you think he's not having the same impact. Some aspects of his game have been good still. A very strong laner still. He actually has pretty good stats in terms of the amount of CS per minute this amount of CS he has at 10 minutes, the amount that his opponent has. He has the second highest differential after Dyrus, so that's pretty solid right there. Interestingly, he has a lot less gold than he did before. If you used to look at the chart, theirs used to have tons of gold going to METEOS, and then Balls would be second with like a decent amount. Not as much. Interestingly, when we had these supportive top laners in play, actually Balls was someone who avoided that. He still kept going for that carry type top laner. So when people were playing Lulu top lane, he's played the least games of Lulu top game of any of the starters in LCSNA. He has the lowest kill participation percentage. If you think of the old Balls, he used to get those kills in top lane, partly thanks to METEOS' help when they were kind of like, he would just live in his lane, gank, always dive that top tower quite early in the game. Once Balls got ahead, he'd be winning his lane in CS, he'd maybe have 1 or 2 kills, and then you'd always see him show up in the fights and be a real force. Hasn't really been the same case this season. He's been playing kind of a different role, even though he's trying to be the carry top still. If we go to METEOS, now we're talking about this is the star. The key thing about METEOS in those past 2 splits is you could look at how dominant he was and how much of a force he was for his team, and you really could say this is one of the only Western players, especially an NA player, who legitimately you have to compare him with the best Koreans. Like if I'd have made a top 10 junglers list last split, I would have had METEOS on there along with Dandy and Kakao and all those amazing Korean junglers we think of. Interestingly, when we thought of the difference between the summer split last year and the spring split this year, the key way you could define it was, we all remember the summer split was METEOS would farm up, get massive and tanky on Zac or Nasus, then he would come in and he'd be super farmed in a way that most junglers just aren't, and that's why he would be impossible to kill and why he'd have such an impact. In the spring split, we all congratulated him. He managed to adapt to the world of the low econ style of ganking a lot more early on, especially getting Balls ahead, especially going bot lane to help his bot lane manage against some of the strong bot lanes in NA. Now, he's actually gone a little bit more to some of the farming style. I think it's a bit more similar overall, I think you'd have to say, to the era of the summer split last year. He has the highest CS at 10 minutes and gets more farm than his opponent junglers in 99.9% of his matches. So even if he's changed his ways in some ways, the old METEOS remains, it prevails. CS per minute, #1. Highest gold proportion for his team of all junglers in LCSNA. In this sense, even if his impact wasn't the same overall, because in a sense, a lot of the Cloud9 players don't have the same impact because they're not able to be that much ahead as a team of the others and win that more games. So overall, it's like a reduced impact from a number of them, really. Once we go past METEOS, and we see he's very much back in his farm mode here, we go to High. Now, High's always been a confusing person. I think it actually took people like Bjergsen to come into the league. It took people like Link kind of establishing themselves over the regular part of the split, Shifter coming to power, to really show what Link High was all about. Because people used to want to say before, I don't know if people have forgotten this trend, they'd want to say, maybe High's the best mid laner in NA, oh, he's so skilled, what would happen if High went against Froggen or Faker or something? We've seen now High isn't really that type of a super skilled carry mid laner. It's more of a guy where he looks very good because his plays will look flashy. Because since he's the shot caller, he kind of makes the decisive move, like I'm going to go all in here and I'm going to focus everything to kill this guy. But it's not really the same carry style as the others. Like, think of Froggen. Sometimes he'll sit on the outside of a fight and just pick people apart. That's not the High style at all. This season, he had the highest percent of his team's overall deaths for all the mid laners. Now, this is what I'm talking about. The key thing is, High will play like an assassin or something like that, but he's almost the guy where he's willing to go all in, engage on it, just go right in on the guy, and he might kill one, he might start to kill the other, and the idea is while the others all focus him, because he's a damage dealer, that's when the rest of his team can just pick them apart. So sneaky, win balls, they can get their damage done, they can get their kills. He's the guy he's a mid laner who's willing to completely engage, and not in that kind of like Zhonya style where you can just go in with like Syndra Zhonyas and then they go collapse, then your team comes in. It's kind of a fake. He'll be the player who on his champion just goes in and he's gonna die, but the idea is he's a distraction. He's letting his teammates get more free auto attacks in on the enemy. One of the downsides of this style of play is that when you have this very risky, very all-in style, I mean, everyone who's played solo queue knows this, there's going to be times where you're going for those 50-50s, or even where you only have a 40% chance of winning it. Sometimes doing that might be the right thing to force a game when you're a little bit behind, or you're about to get choked out gradually if you don't go for something now. So sometimes it's going to have an upside, which is going to be good, but the downside is also that it's a risk, and therefore sometimes the risk's not going to pay off, and then that'll be the moment that people look back and be like, that fight, that's what led to like the real snowball happening, that's what cost you in the end. Interestingly, he has the second lowest KDA in losses. So again, this is telling you the same thing. In losses, he's willing to take risks. He's willing to die a whole bunch in losses. Now, with his particular role, that especially is necessary in his team, to be engaged, to be the decisive move that tells everyone, right, go all in now. Because one of the things I always criticize, I've criticized Shifter about it, I sometimes criticize Bjergsen about it, occasionally Link, is that these players are very skilled. In fact, I think probably just on raw skill, mechanics, hand-eye coordination, I think all these players might be more skilled than High. But the difference is, they're not as decisive at all. These are players where sometimes they'll play a bit passive, sometimes they're behind, and they won't take the small, slightly disfavored, but risky chance that could really get the game back in your control. They'll just hope that the opponent makes some sort of mistake and they gradually get their way back in. And as a result, I don't think they do as many good comebacks as you would have to say that the Cloud9 guys are capable of doing. Going on to the bot lane now. The interesting thing about this bot lane is it's always been a little confusing, I think, for foreigners who hadn't looked into Cloud9 a lot. Because if you just looked at the players, you can see that Sneaky isn't some mechanical beast, which we usually think of as a good AD carry. Lemonation definitely isn't some mechanical beast. Yet together, the way these two players play together, it's like they totally understand exactly the limitations of the other one, but also how to get to that limitation, how to go right up to it and get the max, really maximize and make it as efficient as possible, but without overstepping your boundaries. Which, what's interesting is in a lot of bot lanes around the world, I'm thinking of like Imp and Mata, Doublelift and Afromu, these are the sort of Uzi and Zero, these are the sort of bot lanes where actually what you tend to do is you have the AD carry whose skill level and his ceiling is incredibly high, but as a result, he doesn't always understand his own limitations or the limitations of his duo. And so what usually happens is it's down to those other guys, Amata, Afromu, Zero, it's down to them to sort of keep that guy in check. Like to understand when to let him go and let him go crazy, and when to say, come back in a bit, big fella. It's not time yet. Like, or how to sort of convince them it's time to back off in a situation where otherwise they want to go all in and go for the fight now, but maybe it's too risky. Let's talk about the AD carry first, Sneaky. He had the highest KDA, but that's mainly due to low deaths, because he had the second lowest percentage of his team's deaths for all AD carries in the league. Now, on one hand, you can say that's a safe playstyle, perhaps. You could also say he gets protected by High, or he gets protected by Meteos in the fight, so he's not dying. It's almost what you want from the AD carry. You want him to be just out of the range of getting hit himself, but in auto attack range, doing damage, and then the idea is the others are going to hold them off, and you're going to try and kill them and clean up. Sometimes we call this like the janitor role, you know. He has the third highest kill participation amongst AD carries, so it's not like he's playing super safe, but he's out of harm's way, and as a result, he's not getting anything done. This is an effective style that's working because he's not dying very often, but he's getting the kills. So this is actually exactly where you want it. See, this is a player who understands the limitations of his own skill set and the role that he's being put in for his team. When we go to Lemonation, the highest kill percentage for all the supports in LCS NA. So again, this is a guy who totally, because remember, he's not some mechanical, he's not Afromu, he's not some crazy skilled Uber guy, he's not like the Mata of NA. He's actually more of like an N-rated sort of guy where he's using his brain to win these things. He's understanding when to be there. He's understanding how to position. He's understanding which person should I help my abilities in the fight. Obviously, you don't just always help the AD carry once I get into the actual team fight. He has a really good sense for the game. Also, as a key point I'd put on a side for elimination, I don't think people often take into consideration is, part of the reason I think he's so smart in terms of in the game is that when you consider that it's been said that he has a lot to do with the pick ban or scouting different picks from around the world, I think he has a really good sense for what picks synergize well with each other. We remember this is the team that came up with the Ashe Zyra that was so effective for them. This is the guy who has a sense for what they should be using, and so as a result I get the sense that he understands exactly, he understands the potential of the different champions in the game for the enemy and for his team, and as a result I think that's why you see he has an intuitive sense for where to go and what to do in a game itself. So there's the overall stats for all the players, but now what we'll do is we'll go and look at actually the champions they've played, because that's another part people always like to have broke down. Balls, he has these 2 champions that he's been very successful on. He's gone 9-3 on Shyvana and Dr. Mundo. Once we get past that, it's not that great a story actually, because he then has played 7 other champions and he's gone 9-7 on those. So like a couple of them pretty good, like okay, 2-0 on Nidalee, 2-0 on Rise, they're all fine. But then he has losing records on Renekton, on Trundle, he's lost on Kayle. So you can see exactly there where he's got some champions where it works for him, and there's some where it's a really mixed bag once you get past the top 2 for him. For METEOS, this is quite an interesting one here, because METEOS has a limited champion pool. He has 3 champions where he has a good record on, very good overall, 15-4 on these 3 champions. He's got 7-2 on Lee Sin, 5-2 on Eve, and 3-0 on Nunu. Now, anyone who's watched the rest of this season knows that he tried to play Kha'Zix, he tried to play Rengar. He went 0-4 on those 2 champions overall. Elise, you'd expect Elise to be in there with his Eve, with his Lee Sin. Actually, Elise he's only 3-2 on. So once you get past the top 3 for METEOS, he actually gets a bit shaky there. He's not winning, and the only one he's getting wins on is Elise. Now, admittedly, 3 good champions. You're not going to waste all 3 bans on METEOS. So he's still always going to be effective, and he's very good on those champions. So interesting there that some of the other mechanical junglers didn't fit into that style though. Meanwhile, someone like Eve actually was very effective for him. You go to high, and wow, this guy has played a lot of champions this season. But here's the interesting thing. Usually on these charts, if you've been following the other episodes we do, everyone has this part on the left where they have a couple of champions that they're so good on, we separate those and go look at the win rate on these ones. For high, I think this is the only player I've ever seen on one of these charts where we didn't even do that, because he doesn't have champions that he's done that. Like his 2 best champions this season is Syndra and Yasuo. He went 3-1 on each of them, but that's 6-2 on 2. Yeah, that's okay. It's not really comparable to some of the other lists here though. You look down the list, interestingly, he has a whole bunch of champions where he has 1 win, 2 wins. He has a whole bunch where he's got got a winning record on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 champions out of 13 played. That's very good to have all those wins, but interestingly he's not spamming them overall. In fact, Orianna's the one he's played the most, and he's actually only won 1 more game than he's lost there. So what's interesting here is, if we actually think of the High of old, I feel like the High of old had a more set style of champions he wanted to play. He had more that he'd go to over and over, whereas here, it seems like he's tried a lot of different things. I feel like that's one of the things about Cloud9 that changed. Once they realised they weren't going to be dominant in the same way, especially because the old Cloud9 used to go to certain picks just because they liked what those picks could do. They liked what the tool set was that they gave them there, not necessarily because they were OP picks. In this modern world with higher skill level across the league in LCSNA and teams who are better at team fighting, I feel like now Cloud9's had to experiment more with other things that are in the meta. So METEOS picking up Rengar more, High having all these other picks, trying Fizz, trying Soraka. You can go into stuff like Ziggs. You don't really think of High as a Ziggs player. I think that's one of the things you've seen as a trend from Cloud9 overall. Going down again. In the bot lane, Sneaky, 8-3 on Lucian and Corki. Lucian 4-2. Yeah, that's not bad. The most interesting one actually is once you start going to the other champions. 5-4 on Kog'Maw. Now Kog'Maw, if you go over to Korea, that's an extremely powerful pick. You see it banned and picked. I bet the ban pick rate must be insanely high because people like him, people like Deft, they'll murder you if they get Kog'Maw. Interestingly, Sneaky not so much actually, despite the fact you'd think for their style of team fighting, maybe that'd work. The ultimate, a bit of range, you don't have to worry as much about them getting in your face. Hasn't really been working that well. Twitch, another power pick if you see it with the right person in Korea, to create picks, to get into the middle of a fight, engage without being spotted. He's only 2-2 on it. Overall, not really the kind of dominant style we'd necessarily expect from Sneaky in terms of like having those certain champions that if he gets them, he's definitely going to win. You can sort of say his Corki was like that, 4-1, but the rest of them, it's not really. It's much more mixed. If we go down to elimination, here's a really interesting one because one champion's going to jump right off the page for me, but I'll start with his winning ones. So he has 3 champions that overall he went 12-4, and it's Thresh, Braum, and Nami. Now what's interesting about these is Thresh, totally understandable. I can see exactly why he'd have that because all like utility, you don't necessarily have to be the most skilled player, but if you have a lot of utility, if you're a very smart player, you're going to be able to do lots of different things with that. His Thresh always was quite good actually, even though he's not a super mechanical player. Braum, again, he's got lots he can do. He can quite a powerful, very good at protecting. I can understand why that's there. Now Nami is usually thought of as more of like a finesse champion, and usually the reason why a lot of the Westerners haven't been as good with that is it does require quite a high level of mechanics in a very particular way. Like you have to have really good mechanics that combine with like exquisite timing, and we don't see that many Westerners who've been really sick with that champion. Now here's where it gets interesting, is that Elimination has played Morgana 9 times and he only won 3 games out of the 9. Now that is astonishing because when I think back to All-Stars, I think back to the Spring Split, he was one of those guys who just seemed, for a not mechanically godlike player, really flawless on Morgana. It was so impressive the way he would put the black shield on someone at just the right time to protect that guy. He seemed like he had a really good sense for how to use this champion. We think of Morgana, we think how powerful she is in the hands of like an Afro Mu or something like that. She's so powerful for some of the other supports. It's actually interesting to see that so many of his losses are coming on this champion. I think that's actually worth thinking about there. When you go beyond that, overall, pretty solid for elimination across the board. He hasn't really got, aside from the Morgana, which he played a lot, and so that's what's accounted for a lot of his losses. Overall, he's had a pretty solid pool, we have to say. Yeah, so overall, there's Cloud9. You can see that, okay, they have their core strengths still. Each player in his own way has strengths. They're not a team where one place has completely fallen off and they've had to make up for it in another area. Each player overall is not quite as impactful as he was in the past splits when admittedly I think the competition level was lower in terms of the top teams. But overall, Cloud9's found a way to make it work. They've still got picks that work for them. High is willing to actually play almost anything, it seems, to go with the others. And overall, it feels like that's been the lesson of Cloud9 before. The first split was about just domination. Pick what we want, we dominate all the way. The second split was more like still dominant, but now closer to losing sometimes. We all thought they were behind TSM for a while. We all wondered, what did they have just enough? They came through in the end, but this split's been more about, with all these different powerful lineups in the league, how do they adapt not just to a TSM, but to all these different teams? They can't just do the same thing versus everyone because it might go versus 2, might lose to another 2, might go even versus 1. That sort of run overall probably wouldn't have been good enough. Eventually, Cloud9 has figured it out though. Like we saw, they had like 50% win rates versus some teams, then they had winning rates versus everyone else in the playoffs 3-1. So they did figure it out. That's the key thing. And so when you go into the playoffs now, I don't think you should go as far as to go, well, if they were 10-0 in the playoffs historically, then they're going to go, you know, well, it's best of 5s now, so it'd have to be 6-0 now. I don't think you can go quite that far because the competition level has gone up, but you have to still favour them to win, I think. I think the message of this season is that they have figured people out, and that when they've played someone again who they lost to before, they figured out a way to make it successful, and so I think they should still be a favourite for every round of the playoffs here. So that's the end of this Thorin series. Subscribe to the channel if you want to get new ones as fast as possible and get instant information on when it comes out. But we'll be back with more. We'll profile another team. So goodbye for now.